Zero Trust discovery session looks like, what Zero Trust kind of is, especially as it relates to the previous security paradigm that you may be used to if you have any background in infrastructure. And we're basically going through the gotchas and what to look for and how that transition kind of occurs. So from whiteboard to recommendations and the date. So we'll be going over Zero Trust basics. This is great for anyone who may not be aware what Zero Trust even is, let alone how it relates to your security. We'll also be going over a discovery session flow, basically what you need to be doing to prepare and to index and get every thing mapped within your organization for Zero Trust conversion. Additionally, we'll go over collaboration tips on other IT personnel, key stakeholders, ways to gain information on to help with prioritizing what should be focused on first from Zero Trust implementation. And then we'll actually go into turn the ideas into action of how you actually go about this from a methodical standpoint and where to start. So, okay. So Zero Trust basics. And we're just going to kind of cover the basics of what Zero Trust is. I'm going to go over briefly its comparison with older models, and then we'll kind of go about how to actually audit your environment to move towards this security paradigm. So Zero Trust is a security model that treats every user and device as a potential threat. That is super important. It is assuming compromise. You are to act as though you've already been compromised and design your security solutions as such. Designed to protect data and requires them to be verified before they can access resources on a network rather than relying on network perimeter security. And that's where we're kind of getting into the DMZ previous paradigm, or that whole castle and moat strategy you may have heard people call it. Additionally, there's user and device verification. So in the Zero Trust security model, every user and device must be verified before they can access resources on a network. This includes multi-factor authentication, device identification, or any security protocols you may have in place. So that could be everything from just MFA on the actual identity, all the way down to a custom cert that's deployed on the device that's used to verify or as another element as part of authentication, which we'll kind of get into if that doesn't make sense at the moment. So the previous paradigm versus this, I wanted to throw this in here, especially if anyone has any kind of infrastructure background or security background. They may be familiar with this type DMZ type network architecture, because this was a standard for the longest time of hosting services within your environment and basically putting them within the DMZ with just pinholes on the firewall, so that even if those servers being publicly facing were compromised, they still don't have visibility or connectivity inside your environment outside of this, like services for those DMZ servers. What's super important here is that the DMZ perimeter paradigm relied on the whole idea of creating a buffer zone between external access and internal people. And once you're kind of past that, or you actually are on the inside, there is no other checks or mechanisms. So a compromised account is pretty much got free reign. And there's not really any type of monitoring or anything like that for seeing those type of attempts. Zero Trust takes the approach of never trust to always verify. Zero Trust security is a little more effective, I should say a lot more effective than DMZ perimeter security, because it does not rely on just the limitation of what services are available, but instead includes all the elements such as where they're coming from, what they're accessing, what device they're on, who they're saying that they are, versus your old DMZ where you just have like a port open and a service offering, and you're not really doing anything past basic authentication. There's not really a what device are they using. Let's pivot based on that. What can this user even access? And that hopefully plugs the gap in terms of understanding the difference between basic authentication and more modern authentication, where we have all this additional kind of context before allowing the user to access anything. And that's what's super important, is that each one of these pillars is checked in a good Zero Trust model prior to allowing access. So how do you get from the old way of kind of handling security, this castle and moat strategy with DMZ, to this actual Zero Trust? And that's what we're going over today. So the core principle of Zero Trust security: user and device identity verification. Because again, if we're going back to these pillars, I cannot help but stress that it's super important to understand that we're actually looking at security from these individual elements instead of what services are we offering and how do we protect ourselves should those services be compromised. We're now switching to protecting individual elements with the assumption that we're already compromised. So now we're actually looking at protecting the identities, the devices, the data, the applications themselves. Limiting access to those resources. Second principle is to limit access to resources based on the users need to know. This helps prevent lateral movement of cyber threats in an organization. This is just going back to least privileged. You should only have access to data that you actually need access to and nothing else. The beauty of these kind of models is, as part of the Engagement, there is a criticality kind of assessment for applications and data that allows us to set certain standards. So your more sensitive information, for example, may have a higher standard of access than your lower ones, something not really possible in the older kind of models. Additionally, monitoring user activity is super important. Third principle is to monitor user activity for sign-ins and suspicious behavior. This is super important because a lot of these solutions talk to each other. And that's why we're able to get like the device information, the login, the IP information, geolocation information, uh, as well as the user and everything else during those authentication contexts, is because all these solutions kind of speak to each other. So, for example, if you had a device that was compromised, it may slam right into your conditional access policy that says every device has to have a low risk score. That's a good example of how if someone were to get their machine on an endpoint perspective compromised, that now they're cut off from all network, all company-wide resources. So that's why you can kind of see this is a very powerful solution once deployed. So why does this matter in today's world? As you may or may not know, the world's getting more and more violent, and state actors are becoming more and more of a security threat. And I cannot stress enough, you do not want to be holding or hosting your own services if at all possible. You need to be reducing your attack surface. And so zero trust matters because of proactive security. It's a proactive approach against cyber threats, assuming that you are already compromised so that every access attempt is monitored, as well as ran against your policies to ensure that it is expected behavior. And also continuous monitoring, zero trust, relying on continuous monitoring, real-time risk assessment to ensure that only authorized user devices have access to sensitive data and resources. This is super, super useful. Anyone who's familiar with the sign-in risk detections with an intra-AD will be somewhat familiar with this. So where basically you're still monitoring every access attempt for anything that looks out of the norm. Because, for example, you may not need to know that someone in accounting accessed an accounting network share, but you may need to know that someone in accounting accessed an IT-related share, even if they have their permissions there. So that's what we kind of mean by taking the telemetry of what the user is normally also accessing and seeing how out of the norm it is. So some key benefits and practical use cases. Put some low-level ones in here to kind of get the wheels turning on how zero trust is different than your previous kind of security approach of just throwing antivirus on everything and limiting ports down in DMZ. Proactive threat detection through risk-based access controls significantly improves security posture. As I was kind of mentioning, both on the identity side and on the device side, and honestly, one level further than that, even on the login side, there is risk detections where things look out of the norm. Either something's been tripped on the actual device, such as a malware install, or something out of the norm, unwanted software will actually lower that device's risk. I'm sorry, increase that device's risk from its perspective. And so you can form policies against that. So, for example, anyone who has any device risk whatsoever shouldn't be allowed to access any highly sensitive information. And that's the kind of granularity that Zero Trust kind of provides. Device compliance with BYOD devices reduces security risks and allows for greater flexibility. Anyone who's had to do with BYOD with the Apple and iPhones knows how much fun that can be. Super, super important if you have highly sensitive information that you have policies in place saying that only mobile devices that we know of or that are compliant, that are not jailbroken, et cetera, can access these resources or this data. And conditional access zero trust allows you to do that. Additionally, oh, wait, let me go back. Went too fast. Sec. Additionally, reduced attack surfaces through identity, data, and device methodology, eliminating the need for perimeter-based security. Now, this perimeter-based security obviously would only be eliminated once you're no longer hosting any services from any of your actual locations. So once all services have been moved to cloud SaaS applications or hidden behind either an AVD instance or some other modern authentication kind of layer that we could put up, then obviously that perimeter-based security would still need to remain. But once those things are accomplished, yes, the whole idea is to get your entire perimeter kind of off the visibility of threat actors. Support for remote workers allows for greater flexibility in workforce management. Zero Trust kind of came around just before COVID, but I think it blew up because COVID forced a lot of organizations to have to support working remotely. And a lot of people whose solutions were nothing more than a basic auth VPN found out real quick the problems in that design, especially around like group policy updates or anything along those lines, or rooming profiles would be a whole lot of fun. So by implementing these kind of solutions and moving things to SaaS and having this type of visibility and this type of monitoring, it allows your users much easier access to the services you're providing. But more importantly, once it's actually set up, any additional service, which is that you may spin up within your organization, is nothing more than a either SAML or OpenID integration with them to provide that service. But then they automatically apply to all the build out policies that you may have within your conditional access. So if a new service is being spun up within your environment and you're already on the zero trust model, you basically just build out the SSO, put it in whichever groupings of criticality you have for your conditional access, and you're pretty much done. Outside of user provisioning and other small things. But the idea there is that once you have a zero trust single sign-on methodology that's working, moving your services to that saves you a ton of work. And you don't have things such as split identities. You don't have to deal with password resets on that service. There's just a lot of other little auxiliary benefits to moving to this single sign-on zero trust model. Let's go on to discovery session flows. This is where it get interesting. First and foremost, we have to prepare and plan. So the idea here is that we identify key personnel to help us align with the business goals. We also need to assess the business context to determine any operational needs or regulatory requirements. And then we develop a plan and a timeline for implementation that takes into account necessary resources and potential challenges. So I'm going to throw a couple examples out here while we're discussing this, but just kind of keep in mind that it is important to keep in mind that the business context matters and how that organization actually fulfills its duties, its operational processes, because many solutions may work under certain circumstances, but not on others. So for example, you wouldn't want to move an engineering CAD office to AVD instances, at least not without a whole lot of planning. So that's what we kind of mean by looking at the business context. First and foremost, once we've identified our key stakeholders and that we have to make a plan, we need to figure out where you're currently at. So current state assessment basically includes taking a look at your identities, your devices, your applications, your data, your infrastructure, and your network components. If you remember the pillars of that zero trust model, that's why it's going back to that, because we're looking at what you currently have and how you're approaching security around those. So for example, do you have MFA already rolled out? Are you already doing network segmentation, et cetera? We also assess existing security policies, including the authentication methods for each one of those services that's been identified, as well as the access control and monitoring practices that are currently in production. And this could range from absolutely nothing and we have no visibility to where anybody hits anything, all the way to everything's SaaS based and we only have to fire up the audit log and we can see where everybody went and when. So totally normal for us where you fall in there. The whole idea of zero trust is not a one-time thing. It is a methodology and a paradigm shift. And so there's always more and more telemetry data you can bring in. So never think that's actually completed. Also, in current state, we need to map the data and application access to identify critical applications, data flows, and how users and devices interact with them. This is super important, and it's basically a fancy way of saying we have to look at the actual applications and services being offered by the IT department or by the organization to their end users so that we can properly map them out. The way we want to map them out is first and foremost by criticality. How important is it to the organization? How disruptive is it? Should a disruption occur? And also what users actually access that. And you basically map that out for each of the services within your environment. Additionally, you need to also document currently supported authentication mechanisms. That's super important. I'd honestly say it's probably one of the more important pieces of this, because you may find that many of your services within your environment already support this model and you just don't know it because you haven't asked or haven't dug into it yet. But SAML/OpenID and other single sign-on protocols are extraordinarily popular. Every company has or should be moving toward a solution that contains that. If for whatever reason the critical application or service that you're currently hosting does not support that, reach out to us, and there's some workarounds we can kind of do to put them behind a modern authentication context. But as a whole, everything should be kind of moving towards that. So after we've documented the current supported authentication mechanisms and the criticality and data flows for each application, then we also lastly need to do data classification based on sensitivity. So that's if you have any actual flat data that is more critical or more sensitive than others, as many organizations do. we're able to fold that into the zero trust model so that accessing said data may have higher requirements that you can kind of weigh against. Either they have to be on a known and compliant device of yours, like no BYD whatsoever to certain areas, is just an example of like a policy you can make. But you get the idea of limiting it down to only those who need it, only on devices you trust, because you don't trust anybody from anywhere from anything. Okay, so once we have your current state assessed in terms of what applications are important, what the current auth methods are, are you even using MFA? We do a gap analysis, so then we compare your current state to zero trust principles to identify any discrepancies. That's going to be anything from identity vulnerabilities, such as outdated systems, you're not managing your devices, a bunch of O8 servers running, shadow ITs, if app registrations or other app shadow IT is kind of a loaded term, but it's basically the installation or usage of any application not provisioned or confirmed, approved by the IT staff in the organization. Then we have to actually verify explicitity. That's where we're going to make sure that multi-factor authentication is forced to all the users for identity. Access requests are continuously evaluated, and least privilege access is enforced through regular access reviews. And ideally, privileged identity management is used. For those not familiar with privileged identity management, it's basically where you have to go to a service and request administrative access for your account. And generally, you have to specify why and for how long. And your account is automatically upgraded to the administration, either pre-approval or automatic. You do your administrative work, and then that rights is removed from you. That is a huge, huge benefit in terms of security. Lastly, we assume the breach, so we need to ensure that the networks and resources are properly segmented, that advanced threat detection tools are deployed to detect vulnerabilities and unauthorized access. So again, going back to those pillars, we make sure the devices themselves are supported in this model, that they have their advanced threat protection tools, as well as your approach to identity around your identity provider. So once we kind of figure out how far off you are, next is going to be a risk assessment. This is where we take those problems that we found, or those gaps that we found between our ideal solution for accessing that service versus the current. We determine the potential impact of the identified risk, how likely it is to be exploited based on past events or vulnerabilities. So for example, if you've had identities compromised many times before and you don't have any MFA, that's going to be put way up on that risk matrix as probably one of the first things you can do. Next, we're actually creating that risk matrix. We create a matrix to visualize and prioritize risk based on their likelihood and their impact. If they have any regulatory implications, that's also pointed out here. And then any kind of compliance gaps around licensing or compliance with company policies is also kind of dumped into here. So once we have our risk matrix in terms of what to focus on first, or at least what the biggest bang for the buck relative to impact and current state, we then have to actually write out and develop our recommendations. So the idea is to improve identity security, prevent unauthorized access to sensitive resources, to better manage devices to ensure compliance with security policies, to strengthen application security to prevent exploitation of vulnerabilities, to implement data protection measures, safeguard sensitive data, such as your DLP policies or any type of alerting if anyone copies anything they're not supposed to, or any type of PHI data. Enhance infrastructure security to protect against attacks on network resources, deploy threat protection tools to detect and respond to security incidences, and recommend solutions for centralized logging and automated responses. The neat part is Microsoft does make most of this relatively simple in terms of getting your endpoint protections deployed, and where it gets kind of complicated, where we need the results of that risk matrix and the discovery is when it comes into how much requirements you're going to have to access that service. So if it's a very sensitive service that only executives should have access to, for example, you may limit that to only executive personnel's identities, but also only known and compliant devices within your organization, and only even then if they're within like the United States or wherever your corporate headquarters is. You can get that granular with it. And when you compare that against the old way of, I'll just connect my VPN and username and password and I'm off to the races, as you can kind of see, there's a lot more granularity, a lot more visibility into each access attempt because we don't trust anyone. The whole idea. All right, so collaboration tips in terms of getting this information together, because you're going to have to reach out to other stakeholders, other IT personnel, security personnel, dig through your actual services that are being offered to your end users so you can build out that kind of criticality map. So you have to be able to work with them and get their buy-in. So communicating the benefits of zero trust security to your team is essential to get their buy-in. Clearly explain how zero trust implementation can improve security and streamline processes. You need to gather these valuable insights from your security teams. Leverage your team's experience. If you have anyone who's been through any type of ransomware or any type of identity compromise, any type of attack like that, I assure you, run them through zero trust. They're going to be a big fan of it. Obviously, collaboration is key. Collaborating amongst your team members is essential to gathering valuable security insights. It's important to establish channels for open communication, encourage team members to share their ideas and experiences. This is really about validating that risk matrix and the prioritization of which services and order of operations you're going to be going in comes into play. Because you want to make sure that you're focusing on the biggest impact that you possibly can. So if you have all your sensitive information and it's one of your most critical applications, but it's still just using basic auth and it's like public facing or something like that, it would be extraordinarily beneficial to get that moved and get that converted into a modern auth solution so we can implement zero trust. All right, so in terms of creating that collaborative environment, obviously fostering open communication is key to creating a collaborative environment. Encourage everyone to be open and honest. Clear goals, establish your clear goals expectation, essential for creating that collaborative environment, and obviously celebrating success. All right, so how do we actually then get this done? So converting insights into practical recommendations. We need to identify effective security measures. So based on the applications that you found, the authentication methods allowed, we basically go through and determine what's the biggest bang for your buck that we can implement off the rip for zero trust. That may be MFA. That may be something as simple as moving from basic antivirus to an EDR antivirus. But based on that risk assessment, we develop an action plan to implement the necessary security measures. And obviously, zero trust security implementations are always phased in. They're always phased in because, again, this is not a wham and done kind of thing. This is a methodology and this is a security approach. And so as more services and more users and more data gets lumped into your organization's responsibilities, it's just always expanding, as you can imagine. Outline a phase implementation approach to zero trust security. We're going to find a short-term, midterm, and long-term goals for zero trust security, and I'll provide a couple examples. And develop a resource plan with budget estimates, timelines, and training plans for your staff. Let's just use some examples here of things that can be implemented around a zero trust, depending on what you have and what you don't have. Identity and access management, core component zero trust, helps ensure only authorized users' devices can access sensitive resources. So this is where your sign-in risk detections come in, your MFA policies come in. Your network segmentations, key techniques to implement zero trust, that basically say if they're not meeting your qualifications, they're not even able to access that network segment. Encryption, super important. It's the backbone of all single sign-on, and it is the backbone of almost every public service you use nowadays. It's absolutely critical to be monitored. User activity monitoring. It's always a good idea to keep an eye on what your users are actually doing, because again, the whole idea of zero trust is to not trust anyone and to always assume you are breached. Now, the good news is that you don't have to watch it like a hawk, as you generally have some type of risk detections or some out of the norm prompt or methodology for hunting these down. So you don't need to go there and watch every single person every single day. But the whole idea is that you have that telemetry data available should you need to investigate something. Continuous assessment. This is getting into the monitoring and adapting security measures. Super important to continue to monitor and adapt your security measures around the zero trust approach, because again, you're going to build out kind of a map of short-term, midterm, and long-term goals based on the how much bang for the buck you can get in terms of locking down, basically in terms of attack surface reduction. So for example, if you have one service that's running like multiple IIS servers on the perimeter, I would argue that's probably high up there. Someone used to compromise IIS servers in high school. Yeah, and the whole idea is just to continue monitoring that and adapt that, because there's always going to be more data. There's always going to be more applications being brought in. There's always the business itself needing to adapt. And so zero trust is a great methodology for that security wise, because it's so easy to fold new solutions into it so long as they meet the basic requirements of like SAML and OpenID, which is pretty much every SSO or every cloud SaaS app now. And if for whatever reason yours doesn't support that, that's super weird, and maybe look at other vendors because they're way behind the times. Risk mitigation. adaptive security measures involving making adjustments to mitigate new risks and threat identified during the assessment process. A good example of that would be is if you're watching the news, the war is looking more and more likely, and state actors are becoming more and more targeting towards American companies. I don't know if you might have even seen that North Korea is actually smuggling in people to get jobs now. So that's fun. Um, so the whole idea is that we can actually limit our policies down to not allow, for example, anyone outside the United States to even reach any of our services, even if they had a compromised account, or even if they were on a known and trusted devices. If they were outside the United States, for example, they shouldn't be allowed to access services. That's how kind of granular we can get with this. Basically, as part of that action plan for zero trust, we define like a short-term, mid-term, long-term goals. Examples of short-term goal would be enabling MFA for all users. That would just a good start. If you have any user objects that are currently not being supported by MFA, that generally is a huge no-no. Midterm goals would be things like focusing on device enrollment and compliance policies. That's where you basically define your standard as it relates to endpoint compliance. What software needs to be on there? Is the OS up to date? You can even do custom compliance where a script is ran and it either returns true or false based on that. So you can do it based on something's installed or some other arbitrary designation. Some do it based on like a cert existing within their machine. So you can do all kinds of neat little rules to detect if that is a trusted and one of your devices. Because again, the whole idea is we don't trust anybody. And so if you leave a breadcrumb on your devices and then run that against your conditional access policies, it's not a terrible idea. Now there's cleaner ways to do it than that, but I just want to throw that out there as a possibility. In terms of long-term goals, that'd be more about completing the zero trust architecture and network segmentation. So that's where we're going to be getting into, if you go back to that criticality and that risk assessment and all the applications and how they're currently being accessed, we basically just start at the top and start working our way down. If that service supports SAML or OpenID, we get it converted over to it. We get it integrated into conditional access, and you move on to the next service. If, however, it's an on-prem service that doesn't support SAML or OpenID, then we have to look at it rather creatively. So, for example, if you have an old service that runs on, let's just say, an IIS service, and there are no developers anymore for it, you're scared to face it outside, but you need your staff to be able to access it remotely, and you don't want to use VPN, stuff like that. You can do things such as application presentation or application proxies, where you don't have to open up any ports in your perimeter. Because again, the whole idea is we're trying to reduce our attack surface, not increase it. So you can use technologies like that without actually exposing your services to the entire world and basically hide them behind single sign-on and SAML. All right. So in short, we basically grab all your stakeholders, the people who actually know how your organization operates. We then index all of your current configuration settings. So all of your current security mechanisms, as many people, again, will just do like a DMZ, install an antivirus, and they're kind of done. But we actually look at it from more of a zero trust model. So we're looking for the identities, devices, how the application, the data, and the infrastructure network components, and do they actually communicate with each other? And any existing security policies. And we basically map all your applications based on their criticality and all your data flows and how the users and devices actually interact with them, so we can build out the policies. Basically setting those policies in a way that there's no interruption for your staff, but that make it a real pain in the butt for anybody who's not your staff to access any of this, which is the entire idea.